The air in the downtown Los Angeles courtroom buzzed with anticipation. People leaned forward in their seats, whispering among themselves. This wasn't just any case. It was the case everyone in the city had been talking about. Seated smugly behind the defendant's table was 18-year-old Brent Wallace III, heir to the Wallace real estate empire, one of the wealthiest families in California. With his slicked-back blonde hair, designer suit, and an arrogant smirk on his face, Brent looked like he had just walked out of a fashion shoot rather than a holding cell. He didn't act like someone facing 3 felony charges: vehicular endangerment, resisting arrest, and aggravated assault. No, Brent acted like he was on a lunch break from his yacht. The charges stemmed from a wild night of street racing in Beverly Hills where Brent had sideswiped a police cruiser, flipped a stop sign, and injured a cyclist, then laughed about it on livestream. His followers, mostly other spoiled teens, had cheered him on. The internet was ablaze with clips and commentary, and many were demanding justice. But others weren't so sure justice would come. You see, Brent wasn't just any rich kid. His father was Charles Wallace Jr., a billionaire real estate mogul with powerful political connections, including donations to several judicial campaigns across California. Rumor had it that Charles had made a few quiet phone calls after Brent's arrest. Now, as Judge Helen McKinley entered the courtroom, everyone fell silent. Judge McKinley was no pushover. A former federal prosecutor turned state circuit judge, she had a reputation for being tough but fair, and absolutely immune to intimidation. She was known to bring even the most arrogant defendants down to earth, and her piercing eyes missed nothing. Brent, however, seemed unimpressed as Judge McKinley took her seat and called the room to order. Brent leaned over to his high-priced attorney and whispered loud enough for the gallery to hear. "Relax. My dad knows her boss. She's not gonna touch me." A few gasps echoed from the gallery. McKinley paused, lifting her eyes to the smirking teenager. Her expression remained unreadable. "Mr. Wallace?" she began, her voice calm and cool. "You seem confident for someone facing potential prison time. Perhaps you'd like to share with the court why you think this proceeding doesn't apply to you." Brent shrugged and crossed his legs. "Let's just say, people in this building owe my father a few favors." A ripple of shock moved through the room. His lawyer looked mortified, and the bailiff stiffened. McKinley raised an eyebrow. "Duly noted," she said, tapping her gavel. "Let the record reflect that Mr. Wallace believes the court is indebted to his father." Brent grinned wider. "It's not a belief. It's just the way things work in this city." The courtroom murmurs grew louder. Cameras from media outlets stationed outside the room began flashing through the hallway window. But McKinley's face never flinched. Instead, she gave a slow, almost imperceptible smile. "Very well," she said. "Let's begin." The tension in the courtroom thickened like fog on a San Francisco morning. Judge McKinley tapped her gavel gently, restoring order after Brent's bold claim. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in calculation. She had dealt with punks before, but this one was different. Brent Wallace wasn't just arrogant. He was entitled, dangerous, and unrepentant. "Let's proceed with the arraignment," she said firmly. The clerk stood. "The State of California versus Brent Wallace III. Defendant is charged with 3 felony counts: vehicular endangerment, resisting arrest, and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. His vehicle." "How does the defendant plead?" Brent didn't even look up. He tossed a glance at his attorney, who cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty on all charges." McKinley nodded. "Very well. Bail will now be discussed." That's when Brent's attorney stood up a little straighter. "Your Honor, the Wallace family is willing to post a cash bond in full $1 million. Mr. Wallace is not a flight risk. He is a lifelong resident of Los Angeles, with deep community ties." The prosecutor, Assistant DA Linda Chavez, rose from the opposite table. A no-nonsense Latina with a sharp mind and steel backbone, she wasn't impressed by wealth or name-dropping. "Your Honor, we object to bail being granted. The defendant has shown a pattern of reckless behavior. He live-streamed a felony in progress, showed no remorse, and publicly mocked law enforcement. Furthermore, We have evidence he attempted to bribe the arresting officer with a Rolex watch. The courtroom erupted again. Brent chuckled audibly. It was a gift. The guy was rude. McKinley banged her gavel hard this time. Mr. Wallace, you will remain silent unless spoken to. Is that clear? Brent leaned back, arms folded. Crystal, Your Honor. The judge turned to Brent's attorney. Counselor, has your client undergone any psychological evaluation? The lawyer looked confused. Excuse me, Your Honor? You heard me. His behavior suggests either extreme narcissism or a detachment from reality. I want a full psych evaluation within 72 hours. Brent scoffed. You can't be serious. I'm very serious, Mr. Wallace. Your mouth might be used to getting you out of trouble. But here, it's only digging you deeper. Then came the hammer blow. Bail is denied. The room gasped. Brent jumped to his feet. What? You can't do that. Do you even know who my father is? He's on the board of half the judges in this city. McKinley stood up slowly, as if rising from a throne. I don't care if your father owns half the city or bought the other half. In this courtroom, you are not a Wallace. You are a defendant. You'll be remanded to county jail until trial. Brent turned to his lawyer, panic suddenly creeping into his face. Do something. His attorney just looked down, defeated. The bailiff approached. Hands behind your back, sir. Brent was cuffed and led away, his designer shoes echoing on the marble floor. For the first time, there was no smirk on his face. Judge McKinley sat back down. Court adjourned. We'll reconvene in 30 days. Brent Wallace III had never seen the inside of a jail cell before. He'd never even been in a room without air conditioning and marble countertops. So when the cold steel door slammed shut behind him and the lock clicked, reality hit like a sledgehammer. He stood there for a moment, stunned. His cellmate, a wiry, tattooed man named Darnell, eyed him from the bunk with a half-amused, half-predatory grin. You lost, pretty boy? Brent swallowed hard. I'm not staying long. My dad's gonna fix this. Darnell chuckled, not cruelly but knowingly. Aha, you keep telling yourself that. As the hours turned into days, Brent's confidence began to fade. County jail didn't care about names. The guards weren't impressed by family legacies. And his fellow inmates certainly didn't treat him like royalty. One even threw a tray of watery meatloaf at him for looking too smug. He didn't sleep much. The noise, the stink, the fluorescent lights that never truly went dark. It all wore him down. By the fourth night, Brent was sitting on the edge of his bunk, staring at the floor, his face gaunt and eyes bloodshot. Meanwhile, the media was having a field day. News outlets across the country ran headlines like, Judge denies bail to real estate tycoon's son. Brent Wallace's arrogance may cost him freedom, justice, or just a show. Public debates judge's bold move. But while the public was split, one person wasn't watching the spectacle from the outside. Judge Helen McKinley had requested the court transcripts, security footage, and Brent's social media history be thoroughly examined. She spent evenings in her chambers reviewing every detail. She wasn't on a witch hunt. She was building a case for accountability. It wasn't just about a spoiled rich kid breaking the law. It was about a system that had allowed that behavior to flourish, and she intended to expose every crack in it. Then came the call. A private line on her desk buzzed. She answered it calmly. Judge McKinley. The voice on the other end was smooth, composed, and unmistakably powerful. This is Charles Wallace. I trust you know who I am. I do. I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot, he said. You see, my son's actions, while regrettable, don't define him. He's young. He made a mistake. McKinley didn't respond. I'd be happy to make a generous contribution to your community outreach fund, he continued. Help fund some of those youth programs you're passionate about. All I ask in return is perspective, leniency. McKinley's jaw clenched. She'd heard veiled bribes before, but never this direct, never so brazen. Mr. Wallace, she said calmly, are you attempting to influence a sitting judge in an active felony case? There was a long pause. I'm just trying to find common ground. Well, You found it? She replied, hanging up the phone. Then she picked up the other line. Get me the state attorney general's office. I want this call documented. And prepare a subpoena for Charles Wallace's financial records. Let's see how deep this hole goes. By the time the subpoena hit Charles Wallace's inbox, he was halfway through a business lunch with a senator at a posh Beverly Hills steakhouse. His assistant rushed to his side, eyes wide, whispering in his ear. Charles's face froze mid-sip of his vintage Cabernet. She what? Subpoenaed your financial records. Personally signed. Judge McKinley. For the first time in decades, Charles Wallace was caught off guard. He had played this game longer than most people had been alive. He'd bought property, politicians, and silence. But Judge McKinley wasn't for sale, and worse, she was smart. Back in the courtroom, Judge McKinley filed the call transcript with the Attorney General's office and signed a motion for a deeper investigation. Her staff looked on with quiet admiration. She wasn't just trying Brent Wallace. She was challenging the very system that allowed people like him to believe they were untouchable. Meanwhile, Brent had finally broken point. 6 days into his jail stay. During his mandatory psychological evaluation, he cracked. Not dramatically, not with sobs or screams, but with something far more telling. Silence. The psychiatrist, Dr. Ava Brooks, sat across from him in a bare white room, clipboard in hand. Brent, can you describe how you're feeling right now? He looked down at his hands. His perfectly manicured nails were chipped and dirty. I don't know, he muttered. That's okay, she said gently. This is a safe space. No cameras. No lawyers. Just talk. After a long pause, he finally spoke. I didn't think this would happen. I figured they'd all just let it go. Like always. Dr. Brooks nodded. You expected your last name to protect you. Brent didn't deny it. Then he looked up, his expression no longer smug but confused, almost scared. Do you think people actually hate me? Dr. Brooks considered the question. I think people hate what they believe you represent. There was silence for a moment. I didn't mean to hurt that cyclist, Brent said. I didn't even know he was there. Why did you keep driving? I don't know. I just didn't want to get caught. I thought if I stopped, it'd be worse. Worse than what? My dad. He always said if I ever embarrassed the family name, there'd be hell to pay. Dr. Brooks wrote something on her pad. You afraid of him? Brent blinked. You don't know my dad. That night, a private investigator hired by the Attorney General's office delivered a confidential file to Judge McKinley's home. Inside were decades of campaign contributions, hidden accounts, and silent partnerships that connected Charles Wallace Jr. to more than a dozen public officials, including 3 sitting judges, a sheriff, and even a local news editor. McKinley leaned back in her chair, staring at the papers. This isn't just about a spoiled kid, she whispered. This is a criminal empire built on influence and fear, and she had just thrown the first punch. The next morning, the Los Angeles Times published a headline that sent shockwaves through the city. Judge launches investigation into billionaire Charles Wallace. Ties to judicial corruption alleged. Charles Wallace III's sleek, polished image was beginning to crumble. Inside his high-rise penthouse, Charles threw the newspaper across the marble floor, his face red with rage. His legal counsel, Everett Holbrook, an aging man with sharp glasses and a sharper tongue, stood calmly in the corner, sipping black coffee. This was supposed to be buried, Charles snapped. One call. That's all it should have taken. One godforsaken call. Holbrook sighed. You underestimated McKinley. She's not like the others. She's a judge, Charles said coldly. Everyone has a price. Holbrook raised an eyebrow. Some people don't. And she's got nothing to lose. Charles's phone buzzed. He snatched it up. Another call from a board member. That made 5 today. All of them asking the same question. Is it true? Meanwhile, inside a modest government office downtown, Judge McKinley sat across from a special task force from the Attorney General's office. Papers were spread across the table. Names, accounts, emails, and encrypted messages. This is deeper than we expected, one agent said. Wallace has funneled money through shell corporations for years. We believe he's compromised at least 4 elected officials. McKinley tapped a file labeled Wallace Confidential. And if I authorize this warrant? She asked. Then we freeze his assets. Hit him where it hurts. She looked out the window for a moment. Her reflection was hard and tired. She'd been fighting for justice her whole life. But this battle? This one was personal. Do it, she said. Back in county jail, Brent was summoned from his cell again. This time not by a psychologist, but by 2 agents in dark suits. He was confused, but obedient. They walked him into a private holding room, where a laptop sat on the table, screen already open. On the screen, Judge McKinley. Mr. Wallace, she said, her tone calm but pointed. We need to talk. Brent stared at the screen. Is this legal? Perfectly. She continued. You're facing real prison time, 3 felonies. And after reviewing the evidence, I can confidently say the state is prepared to prosecute to the fullest extent. Brent looked nervous now. Is this where you offer me a deal? No. This is where I offer you a choice. She leaned in closer to the camera. You tell the truth. About everything. Your father. The threats. The money. You cooperate with the state and you may still face punishment. But not the kind that destroys your life forever. Brent hesitated. His throat tightened. If I talk, he whispered, he'll never forgive me. He'll survive. The question is, will you? The camera went black. Brent sat still for a long time, the cold metal chair pressing against his back. Heart pounding, he was finally realizing something no amount of wealth had taught him. That in a courtroom ruled by integrity, not money, the truth was the most powerful currency of all. Brent Wallace III didn't sleep that night. He lay on his stiff jail cot, staring at the ceiling, replaying Judge McKinley's words over and over. Tell the truth. He'd never done that. Not really. Every mistake he'd ever made was cleaned up, covered up, or paid off. But this was different. The walls were closing in, and this time, there was no daddy to kick them down. The next morning, Brent requested to see the prosecutor. Assistant DA Linda Chavez walked into the visitation room with 2 agents and a recorder. Brent was already seated, hands trembling, eyes tired. I want a deal, he said quietly. I'll tell you everything. She didn't flinch. You don't make the rules here, Brent. But we're listening. He started slowly at first. Then it came pouring out. How his father bought off traffic cops. How donations were used to influence school boards and zoning permits. How consulting fees were paid to judges' spouses for doing nothing. How one time, a college professor was paid 6 figures to raise Brent's failing grade. Chavez leaned in. What about this case? Brent swallowed. He told me to plead not guilty no matter what. That he'd make the case go away. That I didn't need to worry about jail, because jail was for people without last names. He looked up, for once without sarcasm or arrogance. I didn't want to hit that cyclist. Panicked. But I kept going because I thought I could. Silence hung in the air. You're going to testify in court, Chavez said. Brent hesitated. Against my father? Chavez nodded. You want to do the right thing? It starts there. Elsewhere, Charles Wallace was preparing for war. His lawyers were trying to block subpoenas, freeze investigations, and intimidate witnesses. But nothing was sticking. Judge McKinley had formed an ironclad barrier between the law and his reach. Then he got the news. Brent had flipped. He was mid-conference call with his crisis PR team when a senior attorney interrupted, whispering in his ear. Charles went pale. That's impossible, he said. He gave them names, the attorney replied. Emails, transaction records. The prosecutors have everything. Charles stood slowly, his hands curling into fists. He's dead to me. The first hearing was scheduled. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but reporters flooded the courthouse steps. Protesters gathered outside with signs that read, "No more special treatment," and "Justice for all, not just the rich." Inside, Judge McKinley entered the courtroom with a calm that belied the storm she was about to unleash. Brent sat nervously on the witness stand, a shadow of the cocky teen who had once mocked the very idea of justice. All rise. The gavel dropped, and for the first time, Brent Wallace spoke, not as a defendant or a victim of privilege, but as a key witness in one of the largest corruption cases California had seen in decades. The tension inside the courtroom was electric. Journalists lined the benches. Prosecutors shuffled through folders. The defense team for Charles Wallace wore forced smiles, but everyone could see the anxiety behind their eyes. Then Brent Wallace took the stand, and he looked different. Slimmer, hollow-eyed, not from wealth, but from the weight of what he was about to do. Judge McKinley sat at her bench, her gavel resting like a silent warning. The gallery hushed as Assistant DA Linda Chavez approached the stand. "Mr. Wallace?" she began. "Do you understand the gravity of your testimony?" "Yes," Brent said, his voice firm for once. "And you're here willingly?" He nodded. "No deals. No immunity. I'm just ready." Chavez glanced briefly at McKinley, then back at Brent. "Tell the court in your own words how your father influenced the judicial process." Brent inhaled slowly. "It started when I was 16. I totaled a Porsche, hit a parked car with a family inside. My dad had it cleaned up, gave the family a vacation to Hawaii, and paid off the responding officer." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. He continued. "That's how he worked. He didn't bribe, he sponsored. He helped the right people, made them feel indebted. Judges, officers, building inspectors. He made sure every possible obstacle to our family name disappeared." "And your case?" Chavez asked. "The hit and run?" Brent looked down at his hands. "He told me not to worry," said Judge McKinley. Wouldn't dare push back. That she'd be reminded who he was. And when she didn't respond, Brent hesitated. He said she needed convincing. "I overheard a call he made, offering money through a community initiative. But he also mentioned her son. Said it'd be a shame if his college tuition hit a few snags." Judge McKinley didn't flinch, but her eyes narrowed. Chavez turned to the court. "Let the record show that Mr. Wallace has confessed to knowledge of direct and indirect attempts to coerce a sitting judge." The defense rose in protest, but the gavel slammed down hard. "Overruled," McKinley said, her voice like thunder. "Let the witness finish." Then Brent said something that shocked even the most jaded reporters in the room. "My father told me once, laws are for people who can't afford lawyers." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Brent looked toward McKinley. "I believed him, until you." That single sentence shifted the air in the room. Judge McKinley didn't smile. She didn't react at all. But something deep in her spine straightened. A quiet resolve affirming that she had just taken the first real swing against a decades-old empire of corruption. As court adjourned, reporters rushed to file their stories. Protesters cheered outside. And Charles Wallace, watching from his penthouse, stared at the screen in disbelief as his son turned into the one thing he could never buy: an honest man. The day Brent Wallace testified against his father, headlines changed. What had once been framed as a case of reckless youth transformed into a massive state-level scandal. Charles Wallace, the billionaire who had built his empire on glistening towers and gold-trimmed boardrooms, was now front-page news for all the wrong reasons. Wallace family empire under federal investigation, from riches to retribution. Inside the Wallace scandal, the Attorney General wasted no time. Raids were conducted simultaneously on multiple Wallace-owned offices. Computers were seized. Financial documents were loaded into vans. Employees were escorted out by federal agents in broad daylight. One image went viral. Charles Wallace Jr., standing in his bathrobe on the balcony of his mansion, watching as boxes labeled evidence were carried out his front door. For years, he'd lived above the law. Now the law was knocking, loudly. Inside the courtroom, Judge McKinley continued to preside over proceedings with unshakable focus. The public watched in awe as she refused to recuse herself, even under immense pressure from defense attorneys and political operatives. They filed emergency appeals to have her removed, claimed she had a conflict of interest. McKinley responded with a statement so sharp, it was quoted on every network. "If integrity is a conflict of interest, then this courtroom has no place for justice." Support for her soared. Law students called her a modern-day Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Parents brought their children to watch her proceedings. Artists painted murals of her downtown. But not everyone was celebrating that in a secured wing of the county jail. Brent Wallace sat quietly in his cell. A mix of guilt and relief warred inside him. He had exposed his own father. He had done the right thing, but he knew what it cost. Doctor Ava Brooks visited him again. "You look tired," she said gently. "I don't know what I am anymore," Brent whispered. "You told the truth. That's who you are now." He nodded slowly. "I just wonder if it's too late." Dr. Brooks smiled faintly. "It's never too late to be someone better." Meanwhile, Charles Wallace was indicted on 15 federal charges, ranging from judicial bribery and wire fraud to obstruction of justice. As the feds built their case, more names surfaced: politicians, judges, police chiefs. The ripple effect was enormous. One judge resigned. A city councilman was arrested. A media executive stepped down. The system, long protected by silence, was finally being held accountable. And in the middle of it all stood Judge Helen McKinley. Unmoved, unbent, and unmistakably victorious. She didn't celebrate. She didn't grandstand. She simply returned to work, presiding over her court like she always had, with fairness, strength, and the quiet fury of someone who had waited a lifetime to see justice done. The courtroom was silent. The kind of silence that felt heavy. Like the world itself was holding its breath. Brent Wallace III sat at the defendant's table. His posture straighter than it had ever been, his expression solemn. He was no longer the smug, arrogant rich kid who had tried to intimidate a judge with his last name. He looked like someone who had finally seen the world without a gold filter. Judge McKinley scanned the courtroom. Every seat was filled. Reporters, attorneys, citizens, everyone had come to see this. She adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Brent. "Mr. Wallace," she began, "you pled guilty to multiple charges, including obstruction of justice, reckless endangerment, and fleeing the scene of a crime. Normally, these charges would earn you significant prison time." Brent didn't flinch. "You also provided crucial testimony against your father, testimony that helped expose a web of corruption stretching across this state." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Brent's hands tightened in his lap. "I watched you in this courtroom when this all began," she continued. "You were disrespectful, arrogant, entitled. You waved your father's name like a shield, assuming it would protect you from consequences." She paused, her voice calm, but sharp enough to cut glass. "It didn't." She leaned forward. "But something changed. You told the truth. Not for glory, not for a deal. For the first time in your life, you chose to do the right thing." Brent looked up, eyes filled with emotion he didn't know how to hide. "For that reason, and that reason alone," McKinley said, "I am issuing a reduced sentence." A collective gasp swept the room. "You are hereby sentenced to 12 months in a juvenile rehabilitation program, followed by 2 years of community service under court supervision." Brent's jaw dropped, not out of relief but humility. This was more than mercy. It was an opportunity. McKinley added, "You'll spend that time speaking to schools about privilege, justice, and accountability. You'll mop floors. You'll clean graffiti. And you'll remember, every day, that integrity isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn." She turned the page on her docket. "Now," she said, her tone shifting like a gavel dropping in slow motion, "let's move to the next case on the docket." The room tensed. The state versus Charles Wallace. And just like that, the billionaire who had once stood untouchable, who had built an empire by twisting the law, was escorted into the courtroom in handcuffs. The crowd went silent again. But this silence was different. It was reverent. Historic. Charles Wallace glanced at his son as he passed by. Brent didn't look away. For once, the power dynamic had flipped, and the man who had raised him to believe he was above the law was now forced to face it head-on. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear Charles Wallace's expensive Italian loafer scuff against the floor as he was led to the defendant's table in handcuffs. The man who once owned city blocks, golfed with governors, and paid off more people than he could count, now sat in a wrinkled suit, his eyes dull and defeated, Judge McKinley didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Mr. Wallace, you are charged with 15 counts of federal corruption, including judicial bribery, tax fraud, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and witness intimidation. The charges were read, one after the next. Each landed like a hammer. Brent sat in the front row this time, no longer the defendant, but a witness to the final reckoning of a legacy that had cast a shadow over his entire life. McKinley spoke clearly, directly. You built an empire not just on money, but on fear. You corrupted our courts, poisoned public trust, and taught your son to treat people as pawns. Charles raised his eyes, but McKinley's stare cut through him. You could have used your power for good. Instead, you weaponized it. And now, this court will do what your money never allowed before, hold you accountable. She handed down the sentence. Charles Wallace, you are hereby sentenced to 24 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Additionally, all assets associated with your fraudulent dealings are to be seized and redirected toward public education and judicial reform initiatives. There was no outburst, no cries of injustice, just the sound of a gavel striking history into place. Court adjourned. Outside, a sea of reporters waited. Protesters wept with joy, and headlines began rolling across screens. Wallace empire crumbles. Billionaire sentenced? Judge McKinley hailed as hero. Real justice. Brent Wallace's testimony sparks nationwide reform. America watches as accountability finally reaches the 1%, but inside, in a quiet corridor outside the courtroom, something else happened. Brent caught up with Judge McKinley. She turned to face him, her face softer than he had ever seen it. I thought I'd hate you forever, Brent said. She nodded. I thought you'd waste your life. He laughed, dry but real. Do you think it'll ever matter? What I did? He asked. Can I ever undo it? McKinley studied him for a long moment. Then, you can't undo the past, but you can outlive it. Brent nodded slowly, like he finally understood. Thank you, he said. For what? For not giving up on justice, even when I tried to stomp on it. She smiled faintly. You're living proof it works. Brent stood at a podium in a crowded high school gymnasium. His hair was shorter now. His tone was humble. Behind him hung a banner, Youth Justice and Awareness Week. I was raised to believe I could do anything, Brent said. But no one told me that included doing the right thing, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. He paused. The kids in the bleachers listened closely. I used to think my last name made me special. Turns out it made me blind. But one judge, she made me see. Applause erupted. Cameras flashed. But Brent didn't smile for the spotlight. He smiled because, for the first time, he was proud of the man he was becoming. Not because of his name, but because of what he chose to do with it.